No one is allowed to read that letter. It's not important. That's what Paige's mother said the day they buried her father. Just hours after the funeral, Paige had asked about a final letter her father supposedly wrote for her while on his deathbed. But instead of comfort, she was met with cold steel. Her mother had torn it apart and burned the pieces. No goodbye. No explanation. Just ash. For years, Paige lived with the ache of never hearing his final words, until one envelope arrived from a stranger containing a copy of that very letter. And what it revealed shattered everything. If your parent hid the truth from you for years, would you forgive them? Comment below like if this hit you and subscribe for more family revenge stories that cut deep. Paige was always the quiet one, a bookworm, a listener, the kind of daughter who never talked back. She grew up in a home that looked perfect from the outside, big backyard family dinners, honor roll photos on the fridge. But underneath the surface, silence ruled everything. Her father, Daniel, was her anchor. While her mother focused on appearances and control, Daniel was the one who saw Paige for who she really was. They had their own unspoken language, late-night talks, shared secrets. But then came the accident, an icy road, a shattered windshield, and the death of her younger brother Sam. The family never recovered. Her mother grew colder. Her father grew weaker. And then he was gone. After his passing, whispers of a letter began circulating among hospital staff. A final message from Daniel, written in shaky hands, addressed only to Paige. But when she asked her mother, dismissed it and destroyed it. That should have been the end. But 3 years later, the truth clawed its way back, in the form of a handwritten copy sealed in a manila envelope. Long before the letter, long before the accident, Paige had learned one thing very early in life: she was invisible, unless she stayed perfect. Her mother, Clarice, was a woman obsessed with control. Every birthday photo had to be color-coordinated, every dinner a curated show. Emotions were considered weak, tears were an embarrassment. Love, if ever offered, came with strings attached, and Paige, being the firstborn daughter, was expected to lead by example. But being an example didn't mean being seen. It meant sitting still while her mother praised her younger brother Sam for simply existing. It meant cleaning up without asking questions. It meant shrinking into herself when Clarice criticized her clothes, her hobbies, her silence. And Paige, sweet, thoughtful Paige, absorbed it all like a sponge, believing if she just behaved a little better, tried a little harder, she'd finally be enough. Her father, Daniel, was the only softness in the house. He never raised his voice. He noticed when Paige skipped meals or locked herself in her room with books instead of friends. He never said much, but his quiet attention was everything. They'd sit together in the garage working on old puzzles or fixing the broken radio he refused to throw away. It was their language built on unspoken trust. But everything shattered the winter Sam died. It was supposed to be a short drive. Daniel had taken Sam out for a Father-Son Day ice cream sledding and one last stop at the pharmacy. Paige remembered waiting at the window watching the snow fall heavier than usual. She remembered the call, the scream that came from her mother, the way Clarice fell to her knees before the words even sank in. Sam didn't make it, but Daniel did. He was injured, but alive, his shoulder dislocated, 2 ribs cracked, a concussion that left him in and out of awareness for days. Paige wasn't allowed to see him at first. Clarice said he needed rest, that he didn't remember anything anyway. She said the accident was no one's fault, just bad luck, just snow, just God's will. But something in Paige's gut twisted. At the funeral, Clarice didn't cry. She shook hands with guests like a politician, thanked everyone for their prayers, and told people they were grateful for God's mercy. That phrase echoed in Paige's head like a warning. Something wasn't right. Over the months that followed, Daniel never really recovered, not just physically, but emotionally. His eyes, once warm and full of quiet spark, now held a haunted weight. And whenever Clarice entered the room, he stiffened. He began to forget things: Paige's birthday, where he left his keys, what day it was. The doctors called it post-traumatic stress. But Paige noticed something else: fear. One night, 6 months before he died, Paige woke up to soft noises in the kitchen. She found her father sitting alone at the table, scribbling something furiously on a piece of paper. His hands trembled. When she asked if he was okay, he folded the paper quickly and smiled like nothing had happened. "Just making a list," he said. "She didn't press. She never did. She now believes that was the letter." Daniel passed away quietly in the hospital 3 weeks later. Officially, it was a stroke, but unofficially, Paige always wondered if it was heartbreak. After the funeral, a nurse who'd cared for Daniel mentioned something strange, a letter handwritten by Daniel that he insisted be given to Paige. But when she brought it up to Clarice, her mother's face changed instantly. "No one is allowed to read that letter," she said. "It's not important." That night, Paige saw her mother in the backyard standing by the fire pit with something white burning in her hands. She never said a word about it. The years that followed were a slow freeze. Paige moved out, went to college, started a quiet life of her own, but the silence in her heart never left. Every holiday phone call was shorter, every conversation more distant, and deep inside, one question stayed alive. What was in that letter? She tried to move on. She tried to forgive the unknown. But the ache wouldn't die. Until one rainy afternoon, 3 years after Daniel's death, an envelope arrived at her door. No return address, just her name in block letters. Inside, a photocopy of a handwritten letter. Below the note, a post-it. "He asked me to keep a copy just in case. I thought you should have it now." Paige's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter, her breath catching in her throat. And when she read the first lines, the walls of her memory began to crumble. The letter began simply. "If you're reading this, Paige, then I didn't make it out of that hospital." Her breath caught. The ink was faint in places, the lines shaky but unmistakably her father's. Each word read like a whisper from beyond the grave. "You've always been the one who listens, who sees more than she says. That's why I'm writing this for you and only you. Because there's something you need to know, something I've been too afraid to speak aloud." Paige read every word twice, then a third time. Her heart beat like a war drum in her chest. Her father had remembered everything from the day of the accident. And it hadn't been an accident. Daniel had written in painstaking detail what happened that day. He and Sam had been driving home when Sam mentioned something, a secret Clarice had told him not to repeat. It was something about the family's finances, about insurance, about the house being in her name only. Sam had been scared. He said Mom said not to tell you. She said it'd ruin everything. Daniel pulled the car over, alarmed, and pressed for more. Sam hesitated, then said, "She said you'd leave us." The next thing Daniel remembered was the screech of tires. The wheel had locked up, jerked sharply. Daniel thought it was ice, but then he noticed the brake line had been soft for weeks, something he'd planned to fix. He'd even mentioned it to Clarice, and suddenly he didn't think it was ice at all. What shook Paige to her core wasn't just the implication that her mother had tampered with the car, but what Daniel wrote next. "Paige, if anything happens to me, look closely at the insurance documents. The life insurance policy Clarice had me sign was changed 3 days before the accident, without my knowledge, and Sam's death. It ensured an even bigger payout under the family tragedy clause. She knew exactly what she was doing." Paige dropped the letter. The room spun. Her legs felt numb. The idea that her mother, cold and calculated as she was, might have engineered the death of her own son was beyond comprehension. But Daniel hadn't stopped there. He even included a list: dates, receipts, account numbers, things that in his words might not mean anything now, but might someday connect the dots. And he ended it with a line that cut deeper than all the rest. "You were always the only one I trusted. I hope this reaches you in time." Paige couldn't sleep that night. The letter was real. The writing matched her father's. And she remembered that night in the kitchen, how he'd folded something away so carefully. This was it. He'd tried to leave her the truth, and her mother had tried to erase it. But fate had other plans. The next morning, Paige took a sick day from work and drove straight to her childhood home, not to see her mother, but to find something. Anything. She told Clarice she needed to collect some old photo albums. Her mother waved her in without much interest, sipping coffee while scrolling through her phone. Paige went to the attic. There, under a dusty box of Christmas decorations, she found a locked filing cabinet that hadn't been touched in years. She picked the lock with a hairpin, something her father had once taught her. Inside were folders, old tax documents, birth certificates, and 2 insurance policies. The signatures were forged. Clarice had updated both her and Daniel's life insurance policies within days of the accident. The documents showed a massive payout in the event of a double casualty involving dependents signed in shaky ink that almost resembled Daniel's hand, but not quite. Paige took pictures of everything. She didn't say a word to her mother, not yet. Instead, she drove home heart-pounding and reached out to a private investigator, an ex-cop who specialized in insurance fraud. She forwarded the letter, the documents, the details. Within days, he called back, "You're sitting on a bombshell." He'd already found inconsistencies in the brake repair records. A mechanic's note from a month before the crash stated that the brake lines were dangerously thin and needed immediate repair. But strangely, the repair was marked as completed in the system by a shop Clarice had taken the car to herself just 2 days before the crash. The twist, that shop had since closed down. No records, no staff. It was a ghost repair. The more Paige dug, the darker the picture became. Her mother had been drowning in debt. The mortgage was months behind. Credit cards maxed out. Clarice had taken out policies on everyone, Daniel, Sam, even Paige herself. But only Sam and Daniel had been in the car that night. The worst part. If Daniel hadn't survived even for those few weeks, Paige might never have known. As she pieced it all together, Paige's grief began to mutate into something sharper, something dangerous. Not just sadness, but betrayal. She remembered every fake smile her mother had offered every time she dismissed Daniel's memory with phrases like, "He wouldn't want us dwelling on the past." And now she understood why. Clarice had built a life on silence, on secrets, on manipulation. But she hadn't counted on one thing: Paige was done being silent. She called the investigator again. "I want to go public," she said. "No," he replied. "You go legal." And that's when the real battle began. 4. Climax and confrontation. 1,100 words. Paige had always hated confrontation. She was the one who kept the peace swallowed. Her feelings nodded when people interrupted, apologized even when she wasn't at fault. It had been a survival skill in her mother's house. Obedience was safety, compliance was love. But now, standing in front of the mirror holding a manila folder filled with proof that her own mother had orchestrated a family tragedy, Paige no longer recognized the woman looking back at her. Her hands didn't tremble, her voice didn't crack. The girl who'd been afraid to speak. She was gone. She arrived at her mother's house unannounced on a Sunday afternoon. The air smelled of lilacs and lemon polish, just like it always had. Everything was pristine: vases, perfectly centered candles, unburnt silence hanging heavy in the air. Clarice answered the door in her pressed cream sweater, pearls glinting at her throat. "Paige," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Didn't know you were coming. We need to talk," Paige replied. Her voice was cold, controlled. Clarice didn't move. "Is this about money?" "No," Paige said, stepping inside. "It's about Sam. And Dad." Clarice's smile faded. "We've been over this," No, Paige said again, her hand tightening around the folder in her bag. "You've talked?" "I listened. Now it's your turn." Clarice said nothing. Paige walked into the dining room, the same room where her mother had once rehearsed sympathy lines for the funeral, where she'd posed with mourners, where she'd told Paige grief doesn't excuse drama. Paige placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside the letter, photos of the forged signatures, the altered policy, the mechanic's note, the check Clarice had written to the ghost repair shop, and on top of it all, a printed copy of the investigator's preliminary report. Clarice didn't sit down. Her eyes flicked over the documents, but she didn't touch them. "What is this?" she asked, still playing the game. "You already know," Paige said. Silence. Then a small dismissive breath. "You've always been too emotional." Paige's jaw clenched. "You said the letter wasn't important," she continued, voice rising. "You looked me in the eye and told me to forget it. You burned it." "Because it was poison," Clarice snapped. Your father was delusional at the end. He was confused. He didn't know what he was saying. Paige's voice cracked like a whip. He knew. And now I know too. Clarice stepped back, but her expression didn't falter. What exactly are you accusing me of? I'm not accusing, Paige said. I'm preparing to testify. Clarice's mask cracked just slightly. Her eyes darted. For the first time in decades, Paige saw it fear. You would ruin your own mother's life. You ruined ours, Paige shot back. You killed Sam. You destroyed Dad. And then you told me to pretend it never happened. Clarice's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. You have no proof. I have more than enough to open an investigation. The fraud, the forged signatures, the brake shop. And Dad's letter, it's admissible. The nurse confirmed it. So will the PI. Clarice finally sat down. For the next few seconds, the room was silent except for the sound of a clock ticking on the mantel. Then quietly, Clarice said, I did what I had to do. We were drowning. He was going to leave us. He was planning to take you and Sam and run off. Don't pretend he was some saint. You think that excuses what you did? I saved us, she said. At least I tried. You don't know what it's like to wake up and realize your husband has hidden everything, that he was planning to leave you broke. So you killed your own son. Her mother looked at her and for once didn't answer. That silence hit harder than any scream. Paige left without another word. The next morning, she handed everything over to the investigators' legal team. Within a week, they contacted the district attorney. The process wasn't fast, but it was thorough. Interviews, sworn statements, forensic handwriting analysis, testimony from the nurse, financial audits, and then an indictment. Clarice was formally charged with insurance fraud, destruction of evidence, and suspicion of criminal negligence leading to death. The news made headlines in their small town. Widow faces charges in shocking insurance scandal. Neighbors stared. Old church friends whispered. The woman who had once led the charity bake sales now walked into court with sunglasses and a lawyer by her side. And Paige. She sat in the front row of every hearing. At first, people treated her like the villain. How could a daughter testify against her own mother? But then the letter was entered into evidence. Then came the mechanic's sworn deposition. Then the nurse. The tide turned. One local reporter even published an op-ed titled, The Courage of a Daughter Who Would Not Stay Silent. Still, Paige didn't feel victorious. She felt hollow. Even when Clarice accepted a plea deal to avoid trial, 5 years in a minimum security facility asset forfeiture public confession, Paige didn't celebrate. What was there to celebrate? Sam was still gone. Her father was still buried. And the woman who raised her was a stranger. But something shifted. For the first time in her life, Paige had chosen truth over silence. Her voice had cut through decades of lies, and somewhere deep in her chest the weight began to lift. In the weeks after the sentencing, Paige returned to the house one last time, now legally hers after Clarice's assets were seized. She walked through each room slowly, deliberately. In the attic, she found the empty space where the filing cabinet used to be. In the kitchen, she opened the drawer where her father kept his tools, still labeled in his handwriting. And in her old bedroom, she opened the frame she had brought with her. Inside the original letter. She hung it above her desk in a glass case where it would never be torn, never hidden, never burned again. It wasn't just a goodbye. It was a legacy, a warning, a truth that demanded to live. After everything, after the hearings, the press, the sentence, Paige found herself in a strange kind of quiet. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it wasn't fear anymore either. She had moved into a small, sunlit apartment on the other side of town. Nothing fancy, second-hand furniture, a balcony barely big enough for one chair. But it was hers, and for the first time in her life, no one told her how to decorate it, how to live in it, how to exist in it. Some nights she still woke up gasping, memories rushing back, voices from court echoing in her mind. And some mornings she'd catch herself staring into the mirror, still half expecting to see the quiet, obedient version of herself that Clarice had sculpted over 2 decades. But she wasn't that woman anymore. The letter, now encased in glass, sat on her desk beside a single framed photo her father and Sam, bundled in coats, caught mid-laugh during a snowball fight. That was the day they'd gone sledding hours before the crash. Paige had stared at that picture 1,000 times growing up, thinking it was just another family memory. Now she saw it for what it really was, the last day her family was whole. One weekend, as fall began painting the trees amber and gold, Paige visited the cemetery. She hadn't been back since the indictment. She stood between two graves, Daniel and Sam, hands in her coat pockets, the wind tugging gently at her hair. For a while she said nothing, just let the silence speak. Then finally she whispered, "It's over." It didn't feel like a victory, but it did feel like closure. As she turned to leave, she noticed someone standing a few rows away, an older woman in a forest green coat watering a nearby grave. Paige recognized her instantly, Mrs. Hendricks, one of the nurses from the hospital, the one who had sent her the letter. Their eyes met. Paige walked toward her slowly, heart pounding, unsure of what to say. "You got it," Mrs. Hendricks said softly. "I always hoped it would reach you." Paige nodded. "You kept a copy." The woman gave a sad smile. "He begged me, said he didn't trust his wife, said his daughter deserved the truth." There was a long pause, then she added, "You did the right thing." Paige's eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She just nodded. Mrs. Hendricks reached into her coat and handed her a small envelope. "He asked me to give you this too if I ever saw you again. I didn't mail it because I think he wanted to make sure you chose to come back." Paige took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a small note, just 4 lines. "Don't let the house define you. Don't let her memory bury you. Live loud. You've earned it." It wasn't poetic. It wasn't long. But to Paige, it was everything. That night, she sat on her balcony holding the note in one hand and a steaming mug of tea in the other. The stars blinked overhead, and for the first time in years, she let herself think about the future. Not about grief, not about justice, but about living. She thought about going back to school, maybe studying psychology, maybe working with kids who'd grown up in homes like hers. She thought about writing, telling stories like hers, stories that didn't end in silence. She thought about Sam, and how he might have turned out if someone had protected him sooner. A gust of wind moved through the trees, leaves scattered across the street below like whispers, and with it came a strange warmth in her chest, not joy exactly, but something more powerful, resolve. The next morning, Paige drafted a letter of her own. It wasn't for revenge, it wasn't to destroy anyone. It was a statement of truth. She submitted a piece to a national journal for adult children of toxic parents, telling her story anonymously, not naming names, but naming the pain. She ended the piece with one sentence. "My silence ended the day I realized survival wasn't enough. I wanted to live." She clicked send. And just like that, Paige stepped into the first day of her life that wasn't built on fear, guilt, or shadows. The article Paige submitted was published just 2 weeks later. Titled "The Torn Letter," it quickly gained traction online. Thousands of comments poured in, people who saw themselves in her pain, who had lived under similar shadows, who had never spoken up. Survivors, fighters, children who had grown up with manipulative parents, gaslit realities, and secrets too heavy to carry. Without ever naming Clarice, Paige's words painted a picture so honest, so raw, that the truth rang louder than any headline. And people listened. A local reporter connected the dots and reached out to Paige for a follow-up story. She agreed this time with her real name. Her interview aired on public TV, her voice calm, measured, and unflinching. "Justice isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about truth, and truth only grows when it's spoken out loud." The community, once skeptical, turned. Former friends of Clarice, those who had once whispered in her defense, now avoided eye contact in public. The church revoked her volunteer title. The charity she once chaired issued a formal statement condemning her actions. Neighbors painted over the "Welcome Back Clarice" banner they'd hung after her sentencing. And Clarice? She filed an appeal. It was denied. Paige didn't celebrate, but she did allow herself one quiet moment of satisfaction. Justice hadn't come with noise or rage. It had come from truth, steady and undeniable. Then came the unexpected. An email from a publisher. A small press that focused on personal memoirs, stories of resilience and generational trauma. They had read her article and wanted to offer her a book deal. Paige didn't answer right away. She sat with it, thought about what it meant to turn her pain into pages. But deep down, she already knew the answer. On a quiet morning, Paige stood barefoot in her apartment, sunlight pouring through the window onto the desk where the letter rested in its glass frame. She ran her fingers along its edge, not out of grief, but gratitude. This was no longer just a goodbye. It was a beginning. She'd started writing her book page by page, memory by memory, not for revenge, but for release. And as each chapter took form, so did she. The girl who once whispered apologies for existing, now spoke clearly, now set boundaries, now lived loud just as her father had asked. Clarice was no longer her shadow. She was just a woman who made choices, and Paige had made different ones. She didn't need to carry the shame. It had never belonged to her. And in that knowing came peace. We all carry letters, some spoken, some torn, some never written. But truth once found demands to be honored. If Paige's story moved you, share it. Comment below. Or tell your own. You never know whose silence you might help break. Subscribe for more family revenge stories where truth finds its voice and healing finds its way home.